In August 1982, the Commodore was officially released. Marketed as the best value affordable home computer on the market, it hit the shelves of stores to massive demand. Having been already showcased 7 months earlier at the Consumer Electronics Show, there was massive hype around the Commodore 64's release. The Commodore 64 lived up to the hype. In just a couple of years, it became the best-selling PC in history, selling more than 15 million units, and it is officially recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records as the best-selling PC in history. The Commodore 64 outsold every other PC company, including IBM, Apple, and Compaq. Commodore was one of the largest computer companies in the world, but by the end of the 90s, Commodore had ceased to exist. This raises the question, how did Commodore go from the best-selling PC nearly conquering the entire PC industry to bankrupt within just a decade? This is the story of Commodore and how they almost conquered the entire PC market, but ultimately disappeared into the pages of history's fallen giants. Commodore was originally started by Jack Tramiel as a government contractor that repaired typewriters. It expanded to include importing and selling typewriters and other office equipment. Commodore would further expand and begin manufacturing its own equipment, including calculators. Commodore's calculators were built using Texas Instruments chips. This became a problem when in 1975, TI decided it wanted to enter the calculator business. TI released its own calculator that was the price of the calculator chips they made, which most other calculator companies used. This meant that if calculator companies wanted to compete with the price of TI's calculators, they would have no room for profit, which led to many of them being driven out of business. But Commodore refused to concede defeat. They went searching for other companies that created calculator chips. During this search, they came across MOS Technology, which was a chip manufacturer that produced calculator chips. MOS Technology was having financial troubles, so Commodore decided to acquire the company outright. The interesting thing about MOS Technology was, apart from making calculator chips, they also made the 6502 microprocessor. This exact microprocessor was used by Apple, Atari, and Nintendo in their machines and would later power Commodore's computers. In 1976, Chuck Peddle, an employee at MOS Technology and the designer of the 6502 microprocessor, knew the power of his microprocessor and managed to convince the Commodore CEO Jack Tramiel that calculators were a dead end and that Commodore should make its own computer using the 6502 microprocessor. At first, they considered purchasing an existing design. In September 1976, Peddle got a demonstration of Jobs and Wozniak's Apple II prototype. Jobs was offering to sell it to Commodore, but Commodore considered Jobs' offer too expensive, so Commodore decided that it was going to build its own PC. So Chuck Peddle moved to California and assembled a small team to build a machine called the Commodore PET.
The PET computer. Now this one costs a bit more, it's £695, but you can see why.
The computer Commodore was building required a programming language that people could use to program on it. At the time, the best one available and practically the only programming language available was Microsoft BASIC. So the team contacted Bill Gates. Bill Gates initially wanted a licensing agreement that stipulated that he would get $1 for every machine Commodore sold. But CEO Jack Tramiel offered him an upfront fee of $50,000, which Bill Gates accepted. Although the machine was moderately successful, there were frequent complaints about the tiny calculator-like keyboard. The keytops also tended to rub off easily. Reliability was fairly poor, although that was common in early computers. Subsequent models of the PET would improve on these criticisms. The PET was more successful in the US and Canadian educational markets because of a genius marketing campaign by Commodore, which was a buy two get one free program offered to schools. This allowed Commodore to write off the free computer on its taxes as a donation to an educational organization. All in all, the PET sold over 200,000 units, with ETI Canada writing in 1978 that the Commodore PET was revolutionary in helping to bring personal computers to widespread use.
Invest in the wonder computer of the 1980s for under $300. The Commodore VIC-20. Unlike games, it has a real computer keyboard.
As the new decade began, the price of computer hardware was dropping, and Tramiel saw an emerging market for low-price computers that could be sold at retail stores to relative novices rather than professionals or people with an electronics or programming background. This computer was the Commodore VIC-20. The computer got its name from the video interface chip, which Commodore had designed. The chip was originally designed for arcades and video game consoles, but Commodore struggled to find a market for it. So after heavy revisions to the chip's design, it was used in the Commodore VIC-20. The VIC-20 featured colored display capabilities, which the first Commodore didn't have, and heavily focused on gaming. At release, the price of the Commodore was a staggeringly low $299. Competing entry-level machines like the Atari 400 and the TRS-80 color computer cost $399 and $499 respectively. The VIC-20 didn't come with a display. Most people connected it to their TVs for use, and also had a slot to connect a joystick to convert it to a console of sorts. The VIC-20 first made its public debut in 1980. The VIC-20 primarily sold at retail, especially in discount and toy stores, where it could compete directly with game consoles. The VIC-20 was a best-selling computer, becoming the first personal computer to sell over 1 million units. In total, 2.5 million computers were manufactured, but its decline would begin in the summer of 1982 when Commodore unveiled the Commodore 64, a more advanced machine.
Last year, we asked our competition to pick the best personal computer based on price and memory. They all chose the Commodore 64. With all the changes in the computer industry, we thought we'd better check again. The new IBM personal computer chose the Commodore 64. The new Apple IIe chose the Commodore 64.
In January 1981, Commodore initiated a project to design graphic and audio chips for next-generation video game consoles. Design work for the chips was completed in November 1981. Commodore then began a game console project that would use the new chips called the Ultimax or the Commodore Max machine. This project was eventually cancelled after just a few machines were manufactured for the Japanese market. After the failure of the Ultimax, employees at Commodore proposed to CEO Jack Tramiel a low-cost sequel to the VIC-20. Tramiel said that the new machine should have 64 kilobytes of RAM. Although 64 kilobyte RAM chips costed over $100 at the time, Tramiel knew that prices were falling and would drop to an acceptable level before full production of the new computer model was reached. The team was able to quickly design the computer because, unlike most other home computer companies, Commodore had its own semiconductor lab to produce test chips. The product was codenamed VIC-40 as the successor to the popular VIC-20. Before the product was presented to the public, the VIC-40 was renamed Commodore 64, taking its name from the 64 kilobits it shipped with. The Commodore 64 was introduced to the world in 1982. The Commodore 64 featured the most advanced sound chip of any computer. It made playing games on the Commodore all that more fun. It had support for multicolor sprites and a custom chip for waveform generation. The C64 created superior visuals and audio compared to systems without such custom hardware. Commodore initially launched with a price of $595, but within a couple of months, they had dropped to $300. Aggressive pricing of the C64 is considered to have been a major catalyst in the video game crash of 1983. The success of the VIC-20 and C64 contributed significantly to the exit from the home computer market by Texas Instruments. Commodore had finally gotten its revenge on Texas Instruments after they had nearly driven Commodore out of the calculator market all those years ago. The C64 was so successful that in the United States, it was compared to the Ford Model T automobile for its role in bringing in a new technology to middle-class households via creative and affordable mass production. The C64 has been listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the highest-selling single computer model of all time. The C64 stopped production in 1994 when Commodore went bankrupt. In 1965, Commodore was experiencing some financial issues. To get out of this situation, they sold 17% of the company for $400,000 to an investor called Irving Gould. Over the next decade, the company repeatedly had difficulties and repeatedly turned to Gould for funding. By the mid-1980s, Gould had become the chairman of Commodore, Tramiel and Gould were known for frequently arguing on the direction that the company had to take. In September 1984, their relationship reached a breaking point when Jack Tramiel complained about how Irving Gould was using company resources as his own, like using the company private jet for his own personal affairs. Jack gave Gould an ultimatum. If Gould was to continue using company resources for non-company affairs, he would leave. And Gould responded, "Goodbye." Jack left Commodore that day and never returned. He had officially quit. This ultimately would mark the beginning of the end for Commodore. But for now, Commodore continued growing and was selling record-breaking amounts of computers. They released the C128. The C128 was highly compatible with its predecessor, the C64. Because the C64 was so popular, it had a lot of software written for it. The C128 was a vastly more powerful computer that could run most of the software the C64 ran. While the C64 targeted homes and children, the C128 targeted the office and professionals. It was released in 1965, a year after Jack left. By the time Commodore started manufacturing it, in 1989, it had sold over 5 million units. But the game-changing release for Commodore was the Amiga, which was released in the same year. Amiga was originally an independent company aiming to build a next-generation gaming machine. The Amiga was shown to many companies in hopes of garnering further funding, but found little interest in a market that was in the final stages of the video game crash of 1983. After Jack Tramiel resigned from Commodore, several Commodore employees followed him to his new company. This included a number of senior technical staff. Commodore was left with no workable path to design their own next-generation computer. The company approached Amiga, offering to fund them. The two companies initially arranged a $4 million licensing agreement before Commodore offered $25 million to purchase Amiga outright. In late 1985, Thomas Rattigan was promoted to COO of Commodore and then to CEO in February 1986. He immediately implemented an ambitious plan that covered almost all of the company's operations. The most important part of his plan was splitting Amiga into two products, a new high-end version of the Amiga aimed at the creative market and a cost-reduced version that would take over from the Commodore 64 in the low-end market. These new designs were released in 1987 as the Amiga 2000 and Amiga 500, the latter of which went on to widespread success and became their best-selling model. The Amiga line sold an estimated 4 million machines over its lifetime. Despite his success in making the company profitable and bringing the Amiga line to market success, Rattigan was soon forced out in a power struggle with the majority shareholder, Irving Gould. This is widely regarded as the turning point for Commodore. As further improvements to the Amiga were eroded by rapid improvements in other platforms, Commodore quickly started losing market share to the rapidly dropping prices of the IBM PC compatibles. Commodore and its system fell victim, much like IBM, to the emergent dominance of the Windows operating system. Despite Commodore rapidly losing market share, they were still a massive company and had a chance to make things right with the release of the Amiga CD32. To put it mildly, the release of the CD32 was an absolute disaster. By the early 90s, Commodore was in deep financial trouble. Post the departure of great CEOs like Jack Tramiel and Thomas Rattigan, Commodore's management was a mess. They were cancelling nearly complete advanced products. The products that they didn't cancel were random and didn't make sense. While Commodore's profits and market share continued to fall, Commodore executives were some of the highest paid in the industry, with some earning more than $2 million, far higher than their peers at Apple and IBM. The gross mismanagement led to the disaster that was the Amiga CD32. When the Amiga CD32 was released, Commodore was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was having trouble negotiating with its suppliers. Due to some financial troubles, they had gone years without paying some suppliers, and these suppliers had had enough. On top of this, they initially couldn't release the Amiga CD32 in the US due to a legal injunction for non-payment of patent royalties. Due to delays, Commodore missed the lucrative Christmas season of 1993, but even if they had made it, it wouldn't have mattered. After Commodore sold 100 units of the CD32, they ran out of money. Commodore declared bankruptcy on May 6, 1994, marking the end of what was a giant of computing.